Imagine a plane soaring high above the clouds. Suddenly, the sky turns black, lightning cracks through the storm, and within minutes, the flight turns into a scene of devastation. 91 souls were on board that day, but none of them knew their lives were about to change forever. From that tragedy, only one survivor emerged, a 17-year-old girl. She opened her eyes and found herself alone, surrounded by the endless shadows of the Amazon rainforest, the deadliest jungle on Earth, where every sound, every shadow, and every breath feels like a battle between life and death. No food, no shelter, no rescue in sight, just pain, fear, and a will to live. Yet somehow she refused to give up. This is the incredible true story of Juliane Koepcke, the girl who fell from the sky and walked out alive. Let's begin her journey. It was December 24th, 1971, Christmas Eve. For most people, this day meant family gatherings, warm dinners, and holiday celebrations. But for 17-year-old Juliane Koepcke, the day began inside a bustling airport in Lima, Peru. She wasn't just any teenager. Juliane was the daughter of two German zoologists who had spent years living and researching in the Peruvian rainforest. Her childhood had been anything but ordinary. While most kids grew up in cities surrounded by friends, toys, and schools, Juliane's world was filled with exotic animals, towering trees, and the endless mysteries of the jungle. She knew how to identify plants, how to avoid venomous creatures, and even how to survive for a short time in the wild. The rainforest was her second home, but despite her comfort in nature, Juliane was still a teenager who longed for the normalcy of school, books, and friends. She had just completed her high school studies in Lima, and all she wanted for Christmas was to be reunited with her father at the family research station deep in the Amazon rainforest. Her mother, Maria, who was equally passionate about biology, decided they should fly together from Lima to Pucallpa, a short flight of less than an hour. From there, they would make their way to the station. The airline was LANSA, and the plane was a Lockheed L-188 Electra turboprop. Julian's father had warned them before. LANSA didn't have the best safety record. In fact, the airline had been involved in several accidents in the past, but Maria felt there was no other choice. Christmas was here, and she didn't want to delay. After all, what were the odds that something could go wrong now? Juliane boarded the plane with her mother and found herself surrounded by over 90 other passengers, families, and travelers eager to spend the holiday together. The atmosphere was festive. Some people carried wrapped gifts, others chatted excitedly, and the flight attendants moved through the aisles with smiles. Juliane sat quietly next to her mother, looking out of the window as the city of Lima faded into the distance, and the endless green of the Amazon spread below them. For a while, everything felt normal. The plane cruised smoothly at 21,000 feet, the engines humming steadily. But as the minutes ticked by, dark storm clouds began to build in the horizon. The Amazon was notorious for sudden, violent storms, and soon the aircraft was swallowed by heavy turbulence. The cabin lights flickered, overhead bins rattled. Some passengers grew nervous, while others tried to stay calm, clutching their armrests or murmuring quiet prayers. Juliane glanced at her mother. Maria squeezed her daughter's hand, trying to reassure her, but Juliane could see the tension in her mother's eyes. Lightning flashed outside the windows, followed by the deafening crack of thunder. The plane shook violently, dropping suddenly before leveling again. Drinks spilled. A baby began to cry. Panic rippled through the cabin. Then at exactly 12:36 p.m., it happened. A blinding flash of lightning struck the right wing of the aircraft. There was an ear-splitting explosion as fuel ignited. Flames erupted across the fuselage. The plane lurched violently to one side. Oxygen masks dropped from above. Screams filled the air. Juliane heard her mother cry out, "This is the end. It's all over." And then everything broke apart. Juliane felt the entire cabin disintegrating around her. One moment she was strapped to her seat next to her mother. The next she was tumbling through the sky, still attached to her row of seats. Wind roared in her ears. Her vision blurred. The earth spun wildly below her. She was falling from over 10,000 feet into the heart of the Amazon Amazon rainforest. At 17 years old, Juliane Koepcke was about to face the most unimaginable test of survival anyone could endure. For a few endless seconds, Juliane had no idea what was happening. The world around her was nothing but roaring wind and a blur of sky and trees. She was strapped to her row of seats, spinning uncontrollably as gravity pulled her toward the earth. At over 10,000 feet, no one survives a fall like this. But in those terrifying moments, Juliane's mind went blank. She didn't scream. She didn't fight. She simply blacked out. Then, impact. Juliane slammed into the dense canopy of the Amazon rainforest. The thick branches tore at her clothes, ripped at her skin, and slowed her deadly fall just enough to keep her alive. Finally, she crashed onto the jungle floor, still strapped into her seat. Silence followed. The engines were gone, the screams were gone, the chaos of the plane was gone. For hours, she drifted in and out of consciousness. When she finally opened her eyes, sunlight filtered through the massive trees above. Her head pounded. Her body ached everywhere. She could barely move. Slowly, she realized she was alive. Against every possible odd, she had survived a mid-air plane crash. But survival came with a price. Juliane could barely see. Her glasses had been ripped from her face during the fall. One eye was swollen completely shut. She felt deep cuts across her arms and legs, and her right shoulder throbbed in unbearable pain, most likely dislocated. She reached up and touched her collarbone, broken. Worst of all, she was completely alone. Juliane whispered for her mother. "Mama!" Her voice was weak, shaky, no answer. She called again, louder this time. Nothing. The only sound was the constant drone of insects and the distant calls of birds. Her heart sank. She knew deep inside that her mother hadn't survived. As the hours passed, Juliane forced herself to sit up. She looked around at the dense jungle. The endless green stretched in every direction. Walls of trees so tall and thick that even the sunlight struggled to break through. The air was suffocatingly humid. Every breath felt heavy, and the ground was alive with movement. Ants, beetles, and creatures she couldn't even name scurried through the leaves. Her body screamed in pain, but her instincts, sharpened by years of growing up in the rainforest, pushed her forward. She remembered her father's survival lessons. If you ever get lost in the jungle, don't wander blindly. Find water. Rivers lead to people. But she wasn't ready to move yet. For the rest of that first day, Juliane drifted between shock and exhaustion. She found a small bag of candy that must have fallen from the wreckage. It was the only food she had. She sucked on a piece, just enough to keep her strength up. When night fell, true terror began. The rainforest was no longer just trees and silence. It was alive with predators. The cries of monkeys echoed in the distance. Insects swarmed her exposed skin. Mosquitoes bit at her relentlessly. Juliane curled up on the jungle floor, trembling, listening to the rustle of unknown creatures in the darkness. She was a 17-year-old girl, alone, injured, and stranded in one of the deadliest ecosystems on Earth. And yet, deep inside, she clung to one thought. I survived the fall. I cannot give up now. That night, as the jungle swallowed her in fear and exhaustion, Juliane whispered to herself, "Papa, Mama, I'll find a way out. I have to." The next morning, Juliane awoke stiff, sore, and covered in insect bites. Her entire body throbbed with pain, especially her swollen eye and her mangled shoulder. For a brief moment, she thought it might all have been a nightmare, that she would open her eyes and find herself safe at home in Lima. But the smell of wet earth, the buzzing of mosquitoes, and the towering green walls of the jungle reminded her this was no dream. This was reality. She tried to stand, but her legs wobbled beneath her. Dizzy and weak, she sank back to the ground. She hadn't eaten since that tiny piece of candy the day before. Hunger clawed at her stomach, but food was nowhere to be found. Around her, the jungle was bursting with life. Bright berries, strange fruits, crawling insects. But she knew the dangers. Her father had taught her well. Never eat anything unless you are absolutely sure it's safe. In the Amazon, one bite of the wrong plant can kill you. So she ignored the tempting colors around her and focused on something far more urgent. water. Dehydration could kill her within days, and in the oppressive humidity of the rainforest, her body was already drenched in sweat, her lips cracked with dryness. She remembered her father's advice clearly. If you can't find food, find water. Rivers are the lifeline of the jungle. Follow the water, and it will lead you to people. Juliane forced herself to move. Step by step, she stumbled through the thick undergrowth, listening for the sound of running water. Her vision was blurred, her shoulders screamed with every movement, but she kept going. At last she heard it, the faint trickle of a small stream. Relief washed over her. She knelt by the clear water, cupped her trembling hands and drank. The cool liquid burned her throat but revived her spirit. For the first time since the crash, she felt a spark of hope. But hope didn't erase her pain. As she looked at her injuries, she realized how bad they were. Her collarbone jutted at an unnatural angle. Her cuts, left untreated, were attracting flies. She noticed something horrifying. Small white worms wriggling inside the deeper wounds on her arm. Maggots. A wave of nausea hit her. Tears filled her eyes. She wanted her mother, her father, anyone, but there was no one. Still, she forced herself to stay calm. She remembered another piece of her father's wisdom. Don't panic. The jungle feeds on fear. Keep your mind clear, and your body will follow. For the next day and night, Juliane stayed near the stream, drinking water and trying to regain strength. But she knew she couldn't remain in one place forever. No one was coming. She hadn't heard or seen another soul since the crash. If she wanted to live, she had to move. On the third day, Juliane made a decision that would define her fate. She would follow the water. The tiny stream would surely merge with a larger one and eventually lead to a river. Where there were rivers, there might be boats, fishermen, or villages. It was her only chance. She tore a piece of fabric from her dress and tied it around her swollen shoulder for support. Then, with nothing but the clothes on her back and the knowledge her parents had given her, she began her journey, alone, barefoot and broken, into the heart of the Amazon. The rainforest loomed endlessly ahead. Every step felt like a battle, but Juliane kept whispering to herself, one step at a time, one step closer to home. Juliane staggered along the stream, each step a test of her willpower. The air was suffocatingly hot, heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying plants. Mosquitoes swarmed her constantly, landing on her face, her arms, even inside her ears. She slapped them away, but there were too many. Soon her skin was covered in swollen red welts. Every now and then, she would hear a rustle in the undergrowth. Her heart raced. She knew the dangers: jaguars, poisonous snakes, caimans hiding in the water. At night, the jungle came alive with the roars of unseen predators. But strangely, Juliane felt more terrified of the insects than the big animals. The mosquitoes, ants, and flies seemed relentless, always feeding on her weakened body. Her biggest fear, however, was infection. The cuts on her arms and legs had grown worse. Each time she looked at them, she saw maggots writhing inside the wounds. At first, she gagged at the sight, but then, somewhere deep in her memory, she remembered something her father once said. Maggots can save your life. They eat the dead flesh, keeping wounds clean. Don't be afraid of them, so she left them there. The thought made her shiver, but she understood. Those tiny, disgusting creatures were the only reason her wounds weren't rotting away. By the fourth day, hunger began to gnaw at her like a predator. She had nothing left but the candy she'd found after the crash, and even that was almost gone. Each piece she allowed herself was like a treasure, but it was nowhere near enough. She tried to nibble on seeds and fruits that looked familiar, but her knowledge was limited. The fear of poisoning herself kept her from taking chances, so she survived on nothing but water. Water from the streams, muddy at times, filled with insects and leaves, but life-saving nonetheless. Despite her suffering, Juliane held on to her father's words. Follow the water. The tiny stream eventually joined a larger creek. She followed that too. Her bare feet, swollen and blistered, sank into the mud with every step. Leeches clung to her skin. She ripped them off, blood running down her legs. Sometimes she would wade into the water itself, letting the current guide her. Days blurred together. The sun burned her during the day, and at night the rain soaked her thin dress. Sleep was almost impossible. She would curl up on the wet ground, shivering, swatting at insects, listening to the endless noise of the jungle. But the worst came on the 7th day. Juliane was weak, her body fragile from hunger and exhaustion. As she stumbled along the creek, she heard the unmistakable sound of an engine, a faint hum somewhere in the distance. Her heart leapt. Rescue? People? She called out with all her strength, but her voice was swallowed by the jungle. She ran toward the sound, tripping, falling, scraping her knees on the rocks. But just as suddenly as it had come, the sound faded away. Tears filled her eyes. She had been so close to being found. For the first time, despair washed over her completely. She sat by the water's edge, sobbing, whispering to herself, "Why me? Why am I the only one left?" But even as the hopelessness crushed her, she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Somewhere inside, a stubborn flame refused to die. She pushed herself up, wiped her face, and kept walking. Each day was the same. Pain, hunger, exhaustion, endless miles of green walls and flowing water. But Juliane knew one thing. If she stopped, she would die. And so she walked on. Juliane had already endured days of pain, hunger, and loneliness. But as the hours turned into days, her focus narrowed to one single thought: keep moving forward. She followed the small creek, knowing that streams eventually lead to larger rivers, and rivers lead to people. It was a survival instinct, something her father, a biologist, had once taught her. Every step was torture. Her body was battered, her legs were covered with cuts, and one deep wound on her arm had become infested with tiny white worms. At one point, she paused by the stream and stared at her injury. The sight was horrifying, maggots wriggling in her open flesh. Her stomach churned, but she forced herself to remember what her father had said. Don't let infection spread. Nature can heal you if you know how to use it. Nearby, she spotted a small splash of fuel left over from the plane wreckage. It smelled sharp, toxic. She dipped a stick into it, then let the liquid trickle into her wound. The pain was searing, like fire under her skin. She clenched her teeth so hard she thought they might crack, but as the minutes passed, she saw the maggots squirm and fall out. For the first time in days, she felt like she had taken control of something. Juliane's world shrank to the sound of water and the rhythm of her own footsteps. Morning meant moving. Night meant curling up under leaves and trying to ignore the endless whine of mosquitoes. She had no food, no shelter. Only the water kept her alive. Sometimes she heard the cries of birds overhead or saw flashes of color, bright butterflies dancing in the shafts of sunlight. For a moment, the rainforest looked almost magical, but then came the reminders: the sharp sting of insect bites, the slippery ground beneath her feet, the roar of unseen animals in the distance. On the 10th day, she felt her strength slipping away. She was weak, almost delirious, stumbling through the thick vegetation. Then, something new appeared. She froze. Ahead, half hidden by the trees, was a small hut, wooden walls, a roof, human-made. Juliane's heart pounded wildly. For the first time since the crash, she saw a sign of civilization, but she was too weak to shout, too exhausted to even knock. She collapsed nearby, whispering to herself, "Please, someone, help me." Her survival journey was about to take another dramatic turn. When Juliane collapsed near that small hut, she was no longer sure if she was dreaming or awake. The world spun around her. She drifted in and out of consciousness, the sounds of the rainforest mixing with her faint heartbeat. Hours later, she heard voices, real human voices. At first, she thought it was a hallucination, but then 3 lumber workers emerged from the trees. They stopped in shock when they saw her. A teenage girl, filthy, half-starved, barefoot, her eyes sunken but but still burning with life. Juliane tried to speak, but her voice was no more than a whisper. I survived a plane crash. The men were stunned. They had heard of the crash. No one believed there could be survivors. And yet here she was. They carried her to their camp, gave her food, and treated her wounds as best as they could. For the first time in 10 days, Juliane felt safe. Soon after, they loaded her into a canoe and guided her down the river. Hours later, they reached a small mission outpost. From there, Juliane was flown to safety. Doctors treated her injuries, and officials were shocked at her story. She was the only survivor of Lanza Flight 508. Out of 91 passengers and crew, only Juliane, 17 years old, walked out of the rainforest alive. But survival came with a heavy cost. Her mother had not made it. The grief was crushing, yet Juliane carried herself with quiet strength. She later reunited with her father, who held her tightly, tears streaming down his face. Juliane went on to study biology, just like her parents. She dedicated her life to science and conservation, working in the very rainforest that had both threatened and saved her. Juliane's journey reminds us that the human spirit is far stronger than we ever imagine. Even in the face of unbearable loss, pain, and isolation, she found the will to survive. Her courage teaches us that when everything is stripped away, comfort, safety, even hope, what remains is our determination to take one more step forward. And sometimes that single step is enough to change everything. Survival isn't about never being afraid. It's about moving forward, even when fear is all you have. Juliane Koepcke shared her story with the world. She wrote a memoir, When I Fell from the Sky, originally in German, Als ich vom Himmel fiel. In 2000, Werner Herzog directed a documentary about her survival titled Wings of Hope. Her story continues to inspire people across generations, proof that even in the darkest of places, life finds a way.